Oh, what a beautiful setting. Unbelievable. Actually, I saw, this is obviously a reprint of, I'm supposed to introduce myself. My name is Bob Eaton. I live near Cummings Harbor in Hartswell, and we've been here for 11 years, and what brought us here is the water. We have our own boats, a flotilla of boats we made ourselves, and I've had a love affair with boats ever since probably as a high school student in 1960. I was supposed to be reading Anna Karenina, and instead I sat in the school library and read The Voyage of the Golden Rule, and it changed my life because it showed me there was another way to live. There was another way to order your lives in terms of the world you find around you. And I want to, oh, somebody's really marked this sucker up. I want to read to you Bert's concluding paragraph in this book. Yes. All of us have a deep, secret, and dominant want. We want a conscientious conviction. Golden Rule and Phoenix, always a part of Golden Rule, these tiny ships said that here were men who cared enough to become involved, to risk being hurt, to risk everything, to refuse to follow public acceptance of madness, and not to wait for others to revolt and build anew, not to remain inactive until assured of the outcome. We became a symbol for much more than we really were. My story reveals some of our shortcomings, but only we know how far we fell short of the symbol. The idea, the urge, the impetus, the inspiration were great. We were not. We were never more than an effort, a striving to rise. As George Fox once said, to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God and everyone. I want to talk very briefly, and I'm going to give you a very brief outline of some of the threads, some of the things that were set in motion back in 1958 by this quixotic crew who never got to their destination. They only got to jail. But by coincidence, another ship, nothing to do with the peace movement, nothing to do with the Golden Rule, showed up to complete a circumnavigation, a family circumnavigation of the world, and that was the Phoenix. And they went and they visited these men in jail and became convinced and continued the voyage of the Golden Rule. And years later, in 1967, I became master of the Phoenix, taking medical supplies to North Vietnam. It's an incredible connection. But there are more connections than that. We know that we shouldn't fall victim to the error that coincidence is causality. So I'm not going to draw you a thread of causality, but it is much more than coincidence, much more than coincidence. Just very briefly. The Phoenix returned to Japan after being arrested and held on the boat in Kwajalein down in the Tiawa bombing area, sailed to Vladivostok to protest the Russian atmospheric testing. That was in 61. In 67, 68, the Phoenix, with me aboard this time, sailed into North Vietnam with medicines for civilian victims of the war in Vietnam. In 67, something else happened, and this is a thread that began to interweave in our lives. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War became active and coalesced into a serious movement in the U.S. against the war. And 2 years later at Haverford College, the War Resisters League International held its international conference. And by coincidence, Randy Keeler and Bob Eaton were two draft resistors there who were about to go off to jail. And unbeknownst to us, sitting in the audience was an obscure academic named Dan Ellsberg. He had the Pentagon Papers for years and been trying to get them into the public consciousness without taking the risk of going to jail for spilling state secrets. He gave them to congressmen, and the congressmen said, too hot to handle. They shoved them back at him. You don't know us, we never received these. He couldn't get anybody to pay attention. He realized finally, and he says in his books that it was part of being at that conference and watching two draft resistors willing to go to jail. He realized then that the only way to get the Pentagon Papers into the public domain was to send them out in violation of the law and risk what turned out to be 155 years in jail. Dan died, many of you know, just within a month. One of his last talks he gave, very short, was based on the proposition that he said, courage is contagious. Courage is contagious. So let me continue that thread. In '71, activists up in Alaska, wanting to do something about Soviet underground testing in the Antarctic island chain, created Greenpeace, a peace movement that was also committed to a green environment. And they were in touch with people in Quaker Action Group who had run the Phoenix into North Vietnam. They say in many of their memoirs they were inspired by the Golden Rule. And that was the year that Dan Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers. Years later, VVAW, Vietnam Vets Against the War, coalesced into something called Vietnam Veterans of America, a more formal veterans organization with Bobby Mueller as the president. Had chapters in every state. Mueller, that organization slowly got taken over by the conservative movement that Ronald Reagan represented, and Bobby Mueller abandoned ship in 1987, quit as president, and became president of the Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation. And they did an interesting thing. They called together a conference to pull together a coalition to ban landmines. The International Coalition to Ban Landmines, campaign to ban landmines. And I was privileged to work for Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation for 12 years. My wife, Wendy, worked for, I think, 8 or 10 years. That led to a peace treaty, an unbelievable thing. I don't know whether Burt and Huntington and Willoughby ever dreamed in their wildest dreams that within 2 generations there would be an international treaty to ban landmines. Not nuclear weapons, but landmines. But courage is contagious. In 2003, the Cluster Munitions Campaign was founded. And they built up a speed and an enthusiasm that a cluster munitions treaty was signed. And then, in fact, ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, was founded. And that was in '07, and by '17, there was a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and they won the Peace Prize. Oh, by the way, Vietnam Veterans of America Foundation and others won the Peace Prize in '97 for their work. What I'm describing to you is a network of connections, maybe not causality, maybe it's as ineffable as we're learning now that trees communicate with each other somehow, either through little fibers or senses in the earth, but it's real. Dan said at the end, courage is contagious. And we are a part of these threads of shared concern and commitment for a better world. Dan was right, it's contagious. But the seedbed of courage is community and learning to live without fear. We live in fearful, divisive times, and people would tell us that this country is riven by divisions, and it is. We have to represent a community that refuses to accept the fear, which is the basis of destroying community. Because in community, we find courage. And in community, we find courage for a better world. And I'd like to think those little strands that were created by the Golden Rule in '58 still live and still vibrate in us, and we're going to see marvelous things in this escalation of citizen action to create treaties and to create new realities. Thank you very much. And I forgot to say, I always tell people that 3 books should be read in terms of this century, and one of them is Dan Ellsberg's Doomsday Book. It is essential to understand the threat we have from nuclear war. The other 2, by the way, are The New Jim Crow, to understand what institutional racism that has endured since before the Civil War is all about in our society. And the other is Dark Money, which tells you how corrupted our political system has become. So pitch for 3 books.